Our speaker this morning is Garrett Graff, son of Chris Graff, who spoke to us, some of you may remember, how many years ago? Anybody have a guess? It was a good 10 years ago, I would guess.
10 years.
10 years. Good, 10 years, for sure. Garrett Graff is a distinguished journalist and best-selling historian, spent nearly 2 decades covering politics, technology, and national security, helping to explain where we've been and where we're headed. Well, hopefully he really will. The former editor of Political magazine and a current contributor to Wired and CNN, Graff is the author of multiple books, including the #1 national bestseller, The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11, as well as The Threat Matrix, Inside Robert Mueller's FBI, and Raven Rock, about the government's Cold War doomsday plans. His most recent book in 22 is the acclaimed Watergate, A New History, and he's working on a new book, which maybe he'll tell you about. Would you please welcome Garrett Graff?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm pleased to have the chance to speak to you this morning. I think my father, mother, and I are the only sort of 3-person OLLI speaker set in the state, and we sort of end up accidentally dividing up different OLLIs over the course of the year. So if you want to hear my father again, he's speaking in Newport in 2 weeks at the OLLI up there. So I'm speaking on sort of a hugely broad topic today about sort of American politics and the state of the world. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, both geopolitically and politically, and save some time for questions at the end, because we've got a pretty small group here, so I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a conversation towards the end. I sort of thought I would use as my jumping off point the fact that we are really right at the 3-year mark of when COVID began to upend our world. Of course, as you sort of probably remember, March 11th, 2020 was the day where we sort of started with the morning of the World Health Organization declaring a pandemic. There was sort of a massive stock market upheaval. That evening was the sort of rapid series of events of President Trump's Oval Office address, the NBA shutting down in the middle of a game when Rudy Gobert tested positive, and then Tom Hanks and his wife announced about 9:30 that evening from Australia that they have COVID. And that was sort of the day, I think, that we sort of declare COVID arriving in a major way in the US. And so that, that was just about 3 years ago now, and I think it's sort of worth trying to take stock of sort of just how much has actually changed. We have lived through, I think in many ways, a decade of cultural, technological, and political change in the last 3 years. It is one of the most rapid upheavals in the way that we live our daily lives that any of us have ever experienced. And one of the arguments that I'm going to make over the course of this morning is that I think we are in for a period where that pace of change is actually going to feel like the constant pace of change over this next decade, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of technology, in terms of our daily life. Our conception of home has changed. Our conception of the office has changed. It's not clear as a society that we will ever return to the office in the way that it was strictly defined and operated, for much of the last 75 years or 100 years. And we're also sort of discovering that the way that we do work is changing. That companies have found, are finding that employees are not eager to return to the office and are trying to adjust to the way that at least sort of their highest performing employees want to work going forward. The digital world has made virtual and remote work ever easier, which has huge implications for places like Vermont as it sort of engages in a national talent competition where sort of working remotely in a place like Vermont, it means something very different today than it did 3 or 4 years ago. Everything feels distributed now. Overseas, we have seen the global power dynamic shift pretty dramatically as well. We're seeing the return of great power politics in a way that many people had imagined was over, at least for a while. After a decade of seemingly steady march of globalization and openness, we're watching a remarkable retrenchment and retreat. Authoritarianism is on the rise in many parts of the country. There's a land war in Europe that is now entering its second year. China is on a path that it hopes will lead to world economic domination in a way that is becoming a very defining part of US politics and global politics as well. Here in the US, our political dynamic has shifted dramatically at home in the last 3 years. COVID splintered the country, killed, as of last week, 1.1 million Americans, leaving aside the people who have been disabled or sidelined with things like long COVID, leaving aside the impact on families that are having to change their own caregiving preferences for family members dealing with long COVID. And it's upended our economy in ways that we're still trying to understand. One of the things that's been really remarkable is that in every sector across the country now, employment is higher than it was in 2020, with 2 really notable exceptions: hospitality and restaurants, hotels and restaurants, the sort of basically frontline workers, people who are in a position of dealing with customers every day, have not come back. That those are jobs that have gone away, and people have moved and changed their preferences to work in other fields over the last 3 years, which is something that probably most of you feel on a daily basis. Walk into any hotel or restaurant or coffee shop or shop in the community, and you're going to see help wanted signs, and they're going to say, sorry, we're short-staffed today. At the same time, protests over the killing of George Floyd and other police brutality incidents have caused us to confront the systemic racism that is at the heart of much of our public policy over the last 3 years. Inflation, a threat that most of us had thought was relegated to the history books, has come back. Supply chains are still tangled. There are no workers. That we are facing a border influx of climate refugees along the southern border, and increasingly in places like St. Albans, the northern border as well. One of the things that has really changed here is we are seeing a much higher influx of refugees coming across the northern border of the United States in ways that was that we'd never actually seen before. This, I believe, though, is only the tip of the global and economic instability that we're going to face as the climate changes over the next decade, a subject that I'm going to come back to. Companies are being forced to the front lines of American politics in a lot of ways that are making corporate leaders very uncomfortable. And the last 5 years have made all of us realize that our institutions and the protections of our democracy are weaker than we thought that they were. We watched over this last year a series of congressional hearings investigating a shockingly close attempt to overturn a 240-year history of peaceful transitions of power. Last year, Roe v. Wade disappeared nationally, and we are facing sort of further regulations and restrictions on abortion across the country, again in a way that I think much of the society believed or hoped was a settled issue that has now been reopened. I'm going to try to organize some of these developments in the course of this conversation and help frame up the chance to ask some questions and talk about all of this. One of the challenges of life is that we spend a lot of our time looking in the rearview mirror. As a journalist and historian, that's actually much of the work that I do on a daily basis. But the challenge is that begins to fall apart when we imagine that our experience now and past can inform us about the future. We are entering a period where that is no longer as predictable a future as we have lived through for most of the last 50 to 75 years. We're entering a period where sort of things are changing faster than we're ready to see them change. Science has a term for this phenomenon. They call it erring on the side of least drama, ESLD. As I talk for the next 20 or 30 minutes, I guarantee you are not going to think that I am erring on the least side of drama. It's worth noting, as I get started, though, that in the first 20 years of the 21st century, in almost every case, the most alarmist among us have been the people who have been right. On climate, on the pandemic, on threats to our democracy and human rights, and on geopolitical threats, we have been largely surprised by the extremes of the threats and not the realities of them. That's not a very comforting thought for how we're going to go through this next decade ahead. I've spent a lot of my reporting career talking to people in the intelligence community. Sort of much of the work that I do is looking at the history of US intelligence and US geopolitics. What is always interesting to me about the intelligence community is they are people who are paid to see around the corner. They are people who sort of spend their day thinking about what's coming next. And in the spring of 2020, just weeks after the pandemic hit, I went out and wrote a piece for Politico magazine about what else experts were worried about. That sort of everyone who had been warning that a pandemic was coming had turned out to be right, so what else should we be worried that the experts are warning about? And one of the people that I talked to was Sue Gordon, who had just stepped down as the principal deputy director of national intelligence, the number 2 person, the highest career official in the US intelligence community, this sort of whole sprawling $60 billion a year apparatus of the nation's 17 separate intelligence agencies. And Sue had a very specific fear, which is, what if America doesn't meet the moment? She said, our institutions are not keeping up with the turn of the earth and they're being devalued in the moment. Society requires government, but we're running out of the structures that make it work. And to me, this has been the thing that has sort of rung in the back of my mind over these last 3 years. There are massive economic, societal, and security benefits that come from being the world's leading superpower. But what happens if we're not anymore? What happens if we're not the place where top talent wants to come from around the world to invent the next big thing? What if the next great innovations happen in Europe or Asia instead of Silicon Valley? What happens if they happen in the Middle East or Africa instead of Silicon Valley? What if Chinese venture capital becomes the first crack at the hottest deals in the world instead of the companies here in the US. And this is sort of now the world that I feel like we have been living in for these last 3 years. We're living through a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of leadership, and it's increasingly clear that government is sort of only fiddling around the margins of the change that is coming. So let's start in Europe. We're a year into the Russian war in Ukraine. And I think it's hard to say sort of who is more surprised that Ukraine is still standing, the Ukrainians or the Russians. A year ago, or 18 months ago, Russia was the second most powerful military in the world. Today, Russia isn't even the second most powerful military in Ukraine. And they have turned to the Wagner group as a mercenary army that they have imported from Prigozhin, the Russian oligarch, to sort of try to stem the huge losses that the Russian military is facing in Ukraine. We have all been surprised by how weak Russia turns out to be and how strong and united Europe, NATO, and the West turned out to be as well. Western divestment has been huge. We've seen companies like McDonald's and Exxon and BP and IBM pull out of Russia entirely. The Russian economy is in rough shape. Vladimir Putin, of course, is now a wanted international war criminal as of last week, which, by the way, might only be the second most interesting indictment of a superpower leader in this 1 week period, which is saying something itself. That's something we'll come back to. But at the same time, the instability from that war continues to ripple through Europe, continues to ripple through our energy markets, continues to ripple through the idea of sort of future tensions between the US and China over places like Taiwan. Food insecurity is turning out to be a real challenge in Ukraine. And it's worth remembering that the Arab Spring was driven as much by food insecurity in the Middle East for young populations as it was by social media. Ukraine is already one of the top 5 refugee and humanitarian events of the last 100 years. China, meanwhile, poses its own distinct threat and challenge to the United States and the Western world, unlike anything that the US has ever actually faced in our history. Whereas the Soviet Union was only ever a fraction of the US population-wise and economically, China's sheer size and remarkable growth rates make its continued rise a near foregone conclusion, although not necessarily a totally foregone conclusion as it faces incredible population threats itself. One of the things most people don't realize is that there is actually a high likelihood that in 50 years, the US population-wise will actually be larger than China. That the Chinese population, which we think of as huge, is going to crater over the next 50 years as they face the sort of second and third generation impacts of their one-child policy, which they are sort of rapidly trying to undo and actually coming up with financial incentives to have second and third children, something that the young Chinese families are not turning out to want to do. China, in the meantime, though, during this period, is almost certainly going to be the largest economy in the world in the near future, and by some measures already is, a titanic shift that the US remains unprepared to address or counter. In a single generation, China has effectively catapulted from a rural, poor, agrarian society to one of the most advanced and largest economies in the world. A technological marvel that, to the extent most Americans don't understand, has been fueled by rampant economic espionage and intellectual property theft from the United States and Western companies. It's clear a generation of US policymakers have gotten China wrong. And we now are in a period of reevaluating that relationship and trying to figure out how we get it right over the next 20 or 30 years. As we think about this, it's worth remembering what Graham Allison calls the Thucydides trap. That in the last 500 years, there have been 16 times when a rising power has threatened to displace and dislodge a ruling power, going back to Portugal's struggle with Spain over global maritime trade in the 15th century to China and the US today. 12 of those 16 cases in the last 500 years ended violently. The good news is that out of those 16, the two most recent examples, the US and the Soviet Union and the post-war rise of Germany on the continent of Europe, both resolved peacefully. So there is modern hope that we can avoid this turning violent, but historically, the odds are not very good. At home, we have a whole set of other challenges. Our democracy has been built for 200 years on majority rule balanced with minority rights and protections. That's the bargain that is at the heart of the legitimacy of our system and the bargain that it depends on for the long run. Majority rule balanced with minority rights and protections. America was founded and thrived on the belief that as a country, we get better. That each generation is more inclusive, more prosperous, and more equal than the one before. That our kids' lives will be better than our own. The genius of the founders is that they built a system where political disagreements were viewed as an ongoing conversation and not as treason. This was a remarkable accomplishment of the invention of political parties in the American system in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Up until then, in effectively every political system in the world, you didn't have a way to disagree with the rulers without it being considered seditious and treasonous. Government in the United States, though, was designed to have multiple centers of power. It wasn't an ultimate arbiter, it was a framework for an ongoing argument. And it's a remarkable accomplishment to disagree civilly as a society and as a political system. It was new and it remains unique. Our promise has been that we are an imperfect union, but one that gets better. Or at least that has been true. That today, we're 40 years into the first time in our nation's history when that has reversed. My generation is the first whose lives are less prosperous on average than our parents. In 1965, a CEO made roughly 20 times the typical worker's pay. Now it's close to 300 times. Over the entirety of my lifetime since 1980, the poorest half of the country has actually seen their share of the nation's economy decline. The top 1% of the country now accounts for more than 22% of our national income. These, of course, are statistics that you don't need me in Vermont to ever mention because Bernie Sanders says them on autopilot whenever he opens his mouth. Life expectancy in the United States has actually fallen in the last 2 years, a first for any advanced nation anywhere in the world in history. We were 78.9 years as the average life expectancy in 2019 and 76.6 years in 2021. The reason isn't that we're more unhealthy. The reason is political dysfunction. On COVID, on drug access, on opioids, on healthcare, on mental health. We're living through a dramatic rise in deaths of despair, overdoses, alcoholism, and suicide. We're not more unhealthy, our political system isn't working, and it's literally shortening the lives of the average American. No society in recorded history has experienced America's current levels of income inequality without collapsing into revolution. David Rothkopf says, history may look back at the period in which we are living and call it the Great Regression. On issue after issue, we're seeing decades and sometimes centuries of progress reversed. And we're deeper into this crisis than I think many people realize. Today, what we are living through is a political party that is upending our normal political system to take advantage of and solidify minority rule. When our country was founded, the population gap between the biggest and smallest state was about 10-1. Today, it's 70-1. And what that means is that there are resulting challenges for long-term majority rule that are becoming increasingly glaringly problematic and obvious. 62 senators represent 1/4 of the US population. 8 senators represent another 1/3, and the middle 30 senators represent 1/2 of our country. The Electoral College is how the only 2 Republican presidents of this century have taken office. It's why Democratic candidates have won the nationwide vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, but have represented only 3 of the 5 presidencies in that time. And how Roe, which is supported by something like 60% of the country, was just overturned by a Supreme Court where 5 of the 9 lifetime justices were appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote in the country. It's entirely possible, as I begin to lay this out, that I think we're going to look back at the last 3 years of COVID as the good and happy and stable times of the next decade. At one end of this spectrum, the US over the next 10 years could end up looking a lot more like Europe, a free trade and travel zone where citizens' rights, equality, and freedom vary widely state to state. The impact of this trend alone could be huge. What we think of as red states and blue states is actually really a story of rural versus urban. After 2020, there was not a single urban GOP member of Congress left in the country. But the whole live in a blue dot in a red state phenomenon, which is what has powered the growth of places like Houston and Austin, falls apart if suddenly the rights of a citizen in a place like Texas are dramatically different than the rights of a person living in a blue state. One of the challenges here is, do we end up in a political crisis merely akin to Jim Crow, where separate but unequal states are separate but unequal, but don't push that agenda nationally? Or do we see the politics of the 1850s where states battle for which philosophy wins nationally? So sort of, is this the 1950s or the 1850s? That's a very different question as we look ahead. At the far end of this spectrum, we could see something more like civil war. And we're closer to this in a political science basis than most people realize. There's a technical geopolitical definition of civil war, which is 1,000 combatant deaths in a year. But there's a lower technical definition of what's called civil strife, which is 25 deaths within a year. Since 2015, far-right domestic extremists have killed between 40 and 70 Americans a year in political attacks, meaning that since 2015, America has existed in a technical definition of civil strife. When I interviewed FBI Director Chris Wray in 2020 for the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, he told me that the far right is now the biggest domestic terror threat the country faces, a message he and others, including DHS, have continued to echo since. I've spent this winter working on a podcast that'll actually come out in 3 weeks, tracing the 40-year evolution of the extreme far right, how it went from the fringes to the political mainstream. It's marking the 30th anniversary of the Waco siege, which is right now, this spring, April 19th, the day of the 30th anniversary of that fire in Waco. And it is a remarkable and troubling evolution of how something that lived on the sort of fringes of the far right has now become the main animating principle of the heart of the modern GOP. Today, when you take all of this together, it's a question less, I think, of whether America ends up in a civil war, and more which America, or whether any America, emerges victorious at the end of this strife. If it feels like today's polarization is different, it's because it is. Our polarization is literally driving families apart. Political scientists measured Thanksgiving in 2016, and they discovered that Thanksgivings were 30 to 50 minutes shorter in families with mixed politics, as opposed to single-party families. If any of you have had to sit across from that other person in your family at Thanksgiving, you might feel that in your bones, in 1960, just 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they wouldn't want their kids to marry someone from the other party. Today, that's half of Republicans and a third of Democrats. Today, red and blue America are increasingly lifestyle choices, not just political ones. And they're ones that we view as increasingly incompatible with each other. Battle lines that have not changed dramatically since the Civil War, even as we have expanded westward since. We have a misconception, I believe, of what that Civil War could look like. It looks sort of this idea that it would be, men in suits and beards meeting in state houses with formal secession documents, sort of a la South Carolina and 1861. It might look much more like what Bleeding Kansas looked like before the Civil War, or what Reconstruction looked like after. Individual militias and armed groups trying to seize and hold territory, intimidate elected officials, and attempt to destabilize federal control in select areas. In fact, if you listen to me as I say that, armed groups trying to seize and hold territory, take over federal buildings, intimidate elected officials, and destabilize federal control in select areas, you can sort of think of times when every step of that has happened in the last 2 years in our country. The Texas GOP has adopted a platform that openly declares Joe Biden's presidency illegitimate. Whether our country can sustain itself amid these growing imbalances and competing visions for the future is a real open question. Does the US end up looking something more like Hungary, an authoritarian democracy, or does it last at all? These are not small questions. Texas on its own would stand as the 40th largest country in the world and the 10th largest economy, roughly the size of Canada. California on its own would stand as the 5th largest economy in the world, larger than the UK. Blue America, the 17 states where Democrats consistently hold control, would actually be the 2nd largest economy in the world today. And red America, the 25 states where the GOP typically wins, would be the 3rd largest. All of this is underpinned by the fact that we're not wrong that our government is failing us, that our faith in institutions is falling, but that's partly because we're right to see that our institutions can't keep up with this level of change and polarization. COVID politicized institutions like the FDA and CDC, which were supposed to be among the most apolitical and respected institutions in our world. Part of what Sue Gordon talked about in that conversation we had in the spring of 2020 is how this becomes a self-defeating loop. That government's inability to address our biggest challenges continues to drive us to opt out of government, which makes government even less capable and less responsive. Underpinning all of this, we are a country that is getting more afraid. We, in 2020, there were 17 million new guns purchased in America. And I don't think anyone probably looks around at America in 2019 and says, this is a country that could use 17 million more guns than we have right now. All of this is being exacerbated by a collapse of our shared information ecosystem. News deserts, disinformation, misinformation, media bubbles. We're living through right now this incredible window into how Fox News, with this Dominion voting system lawsuit, literally and openly lies to its viewers on a nightly basis in a joke that all of the hosts are in on, and yet they have so little respect for their viewers that they are willing to lie to them to avoid the chance that they will not maximize their corporate profits. All of this is happening while the economy, all personal feelings to the contrary, is actually going great. So one of the challenges that we face, and we're sort of standing, it feels, on this precipice of sort of, does this Silicon Valley bank question tip into something that we actually have to care about, or can we pretend that this is something that only matters to Silicon Valley? What happens if and when our country actually tips into an active recession or depression in the years ahead? This is the good times. This is all, of course, also before the effects of climate change hit us. We think of climate right now mostly as a tech and economic challenge. How quickly can we adopt renewables? How quickly can we switch to electric vehicles and curb greenhouse gases? Climate over the next decade is about to become the primary driver of our politics and our geopolitics. Climate change isn't just going to be one more priority on our overly crowded list of priorities. It is a threat multiplier that affects every other priority that we face, from the air we breathe to the food we eat. In 2018, the World Bank estimated that just 3 regions, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, will generate 143 million climate migrants by 2050. That's 143 million people in motion around the world from just 3 regions. I mean, that's a level of sort of unpredictable geopolitical chaos that we can only imagine. That's overseas. In the US, by 2050, 13 million Americans are going to be forced from their homes because of climate change. Large portions of the country are about to be hit by either too much water or not enough. This is coastal New England, Louisiana, the Carolinas, California, Florida. Lake Mead is drying up, the Great Salt Lake is drying up. If you are not tuned into the Great Salt Lake, it is worth reading about. It's one of the most sort of fascinating scientific challenges that we face in the country. When it dries up, the Great Salt Lake is going to become a giant cloud of arsenic dust that is going to poison Salt Lake City and make it all but uninhabitable. California is either burning or flooding, depending on which season we're talking about. Miami is flooding. New York City, Superstorm Sandy wasn't even a hurricane when it hit New York, and it still required $40 billion in repairs. A Category 2 or Category 3 hurricane would put enormous parts of New York City underwater, including both of its airports, LaGuardia and JFK, as well as half of Brooklyn, half of Queens, and half of Manhattan. Tell me what that does to New York if a Category 2 or Category 3 climate change fueled hurricane hits New York. We don't really know what happens in each of these instances because we don't really understand what happens when you begin to pile these risks and threats on top of one another. Climate scientists think their models might actually underpredict the future. Remember what I said earlier about science generally erring on the least side of drama. The drama they now estimate might be 200% higher than the estimates that they had just 20 years ago. Think about how droughts fuel wildflowers and then how wildfires fuel flash floods. Think about what this is going to mean for our food supplies, for the insurance industry, for the mortgage industry, parts of our country and parts of the world that we rely on to grow corn are about to be unable to grow corn. Think about what this means for Vermont in 50 years when we have the climate of North Carolina. North Carolina, not particularly well known for its maple syrup. What's going to happen when we're all sort of looking to Nova Scotia for our maple syrup? Think about what this means for internal migration inside the United States, for political dysfunction, for shifting tax bases. Think of what this means for workforce talent. Think about what this means for the change in the way that remote work is affected by 13 million people moving out of their homes inside the United States because their homes are literally unlivable. Combine the climate problem with the political problem, and the US is about to shrink a lot for a lot of people. A lot of this country is going to be considered to be unlivable for climate challenges or political challenges, depending on sort of which side you are on over the next 50 years. The pandemic exposed the fragility of our global supply chain, from semiconductors to shipping containers. And we've seen now much more clearly how individual components can throw an entire supply chain into chaos. Think about what all of this means for the world that's about to get crazier. Do any of you think, looking at the last 3 years, that we will handle the next pandemic better? Does any of you think that we will handle the next election crisis better? What if, as Sue Gordon told me 3 years ago, America just doesn't meet this moment? All right, I'm gonna stop there. There's a lot more that we can talk about, but I hope that has given you enough to think about and worry about. So I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions.
All of us here can think, well, 50 years, we probably won't be here. Thank God.
Just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
have you ever read Alvin Toffler's Third Wave?
Yes, not recently, but yes.
But you're familiar with this?
Yeah.
Because he makes some pretty interesting predictions about where we're headed as a civilization.
Yeah, and I'm leaving aside sort of in a whole series of sort of tech questions, the breakthroughs that we have seen in artificial intelligence in the last 6 months here are breathtaking. This is an area that I spend a lot of my time working on. I was in DC last week for 3 days of national security focused meetings. All anyone wanted to talk about was the national security threats of AI. And there's sort of one tier of that is a national security challenge. One of the people that I was sitting with and talking about he was saying what he wakes up every day and worries about is AI plus bio, which is a university lab today can hook an AI system up to basically a virus development system. That's not what they're technically called, but that's what it does. And build a virus that we have never seen before. That's at a university lab now. In 10 years, any competent high school student in the AV club is going to be able to build that on their home computer. This becomes a very different challenge. Bio is about to be the same threat that cybersecurity has been for the last 10 years. The challenge, of course, is it's much easier for you to patch your Microsoft Word and update your iPhone system than it is to patch the human immune system. And that becomes, that's like a whole other challenge on the national security threat side. Then there's sort of the economic challenge of AI is about to wipe out a whole tier of sort of like good enough jobs in America. Sort of coming for sort of every last customer service representative in the economy. Sort of people who do sort of run-of-the-mill writing. People who do, sort of basic jobs with language are about to be very replaceable with AIs much more powerful than we have ever imagined before. So, yes.
It's not on that topic.
No,
but,
please.
But I see something happening in Vermont that is kind of interesting, and I just want to know your thoughts on it. The local governments are being, what I would say is minority ruled.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, my town puts in the state legislature Democrats, but everybody on the select board is more conservative, more Republicans, and I know that seems to be kind of a national trend. Do you see that continuing, and what type of an impact will that have overall on what's going on?
Yeah, and I think that this is something that Democrats have been behind on for, you can go way back, but certainly the last 20 years, which is realizing sort of how important that sort of ever more local level is, and the way that it trickles up, right? That, you get control of your state legislature, and then that's what sets redistricting. That's what allows you to sort of select your congressional districts. That's what helps drive, the Republican, majority in the U.S. House. We're seeing that happen in a very concentrated way in the last 2 years, at the school board level, at the library board level, at the local, select board level.
But Vermont's still putting in the state legislature now has the supermajority.
Yes.
So I guess I don't get how how the individual town things are gonna start moving up into.
Yeah, well, so part of that issue is Republicans are better about putting money into those local races than Democrats are. Some of that is a sort of coordinated national strategy to focus candidates on those races. And then, this is sort of like the fundamental challenge of American politics is elections are won by the people who show up and vote. And so, how, who your local leaders are is something that is shifting in real time in America, because what we are seeing is the politicization of a whole tier of roles that sort of didn't used to be political. The sort of the old like local, local politics adage is, there's not a Republican way to fill a pothole and a Democratic way to fill a pothole. The person in charge of snow plowing, you shouldn't have to care whether that person is a Democrat or a Republican. And what we are seeing is that sort of suddenly all of those jobs are becoming politicized in an ideological way that we're not used to. Most of all, people in charge of elections across the country. And that sort of, it didn't used to matter who your sort of election official was at your local, your local precinct or your local voting board. And now, some of those are the most hotly contested races in a community. Yeah.
We did kind of see an example of the tyranny of the minority in the leadership of the Republican Party, and you had to give away the store. So minority rights were abused, basically.
Yeah, and I think that this is, you know, this is the same challenge that the Republican Party is going to face in 2024, which is Donald Trump is still on track to only win, you know, 34, 37, 32% of the primary vote. Which if it's a two-way race, 32, 34, 37% is not enough to win the primary. If it's a five-way race, again, that is exactly how Donald Trump won in 2016, and presumably sort of still a path forward for him for 2024. What's interesting, of course, is that this is the exact strategy that Democrats watched Donald Trump do in 2016, and then stopped Bernie Sanders from doing in 2020. You know, Bernie Sanders was about to sort of run away with the Democratic nomination in January 2020 with 32, 34, 37% of the vote. And there was that weekend where Mayor Pete dropped out, where Amy Klobuchar dropped out, sort of basically everyone emptied the field in the course of a weekend to allow Joe Biden, who was sort of the, I'm making all of these numbers up, but they're sort of generally accurate for the purposes of storytelling, who was previously the 24% candidate, the chance to sort of have everyone who was not Bernie coalesce behind Biden and deliver the nomination to Biden. And so, you know, one of the questions coming forward, and, you know, who knows how, if there's an indictment this week, what that ends up doing. If there's a federal indictment, who knows what that ends up doing. If there's a Georgia indictment, who knows what that ends up doing going forward. But, you know, whether the Republicans will learn that lesson if a year from now they are staring down Donald Trump continuing to win 32, 34, 37% of the election, of the primary, in a field that has Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, DeSantis, you know, Rick Scott, you know, who else and whomever, is gonna, you know, it is to me a really open question, because it's sort of the challenge of, it is a challenge that the Republican Party couldn't handle in 2016, that the Democratic Party sort of very handedly handled in 2020. Yes?
How would ranked choice voting come into play in this scenario where we have, you know, 5 candidates with, you know, because right now in our Vermont legislature, they're talking about ranked choice voting for presidential primary.
Yeah. I think the challenge is, you know, it would depend wildly, right? You know, it depends on the candidates in the race. It depends on, I think part of the challenge is Donald Trump may be the second choice of more Republican primary voters than any other of those candidates. You know, and that a little bit of the challenge of Donald Trump working his way through the Republican primary is you're talking about a population that is only is only Republican primary voters, which is a very specific slice of the electorate. To sort of answer your sort of broader question, you know, ranked choice voting in the presidential general election would certainly open the way, would open the path to sort of more serious third-party candidates that would not risk sort of electing the opposite, a la, you know, a Ralph Nader 2000 situation. So, yeah.
Garrett, you've talked about a host of concerns and challenges. You're optimistic about any of these huge issues?
No, I'm not. And you know, at a very basic level, I think that you know, I sort of remain generally hopeful that we'll sort of muddle our way through this. I mean, there's sort of the famous, I think it's the Winston Churchill line, you know, America always does the right thing after it has exhausted all other possibilities. But I don't think, and I am, by the way, much more optimistic about the sort of overall arc of our democracy after last November's election than I was, you know, say 1 year ago. But, you know, I think until we sort of see where we are in the arc of the modern Republican Party, I am not optimistic about what this next decade is going to bring. I mean, sort of one of the things that I always make the point of saying is, you know, as a historian, the challenge of Donald Trump is we don't know where we are in the Donald Trump story. Are we in the beginning, the middle, or the end? And until we know how that story ends, there are a lot of moving pieces that are going to sort of remain troublesome and worrisome to me. And you know, this is a unique figure in American history, and one that sort of fundamentally represents a different set of risks to American democracy long term than anything that we've seen before. Yeah.
One of the thoughts that I entertain has to do with keeping the military on the side of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
General Milley's he's had to bump heads a number of times, but within the military, there are elements that are on the other side.
Yes.
And lots of countries are woken up in the morning with some general in charge of it.
Yep. And so one of the things that's interesting to me is, again, as a historian, we look at sort of the 7 days in May scenario, you know, the old Fletcher Nebel Cold War novel about a military coup in America. And we've always imagined that we wouldn't welcome that the military coup would be something that would be bad for the country. There are plenty of Americans who, in the last 4 years, would have welcomed a military coup if it had sort of been the 82nd Airborne surrounding the White House on the evening of January 6th and saying, you know, your presidency is done, you know, we're going to escort you to a friendly non-extradition country in South America, and you know, we're on the side of Mike Pence. There's another chunk of America that would sort of still believes that would be the right thing to do now. You know, there is a not small chunk of the country that believes, you know, that Joe Biden was not lawfully elected the president of the United States. And I think sort of one of the challenges as we think about this is, you know, not just how we keep the military on the side of democracy, but how we keep the military out of politics, period. And that's a really hard challenge for precisely the reasons that you point out, which is, you know, one of the things that I think has become clear in the January 6th hearings, as Liz Cheney led them through last year, is sort of how close we came to sort of someone, to sort of relying on the right person in the right job at the right moment, saying yes or no. And that sort of the institutions turn out to be weaker than we sort of thought that they were. And I think that sort of, to me, part of the Mike Pence story is Mike Pence was that Winston Churchill quote. Like, Mike Pence did the right thing on January 6th only after a very thorough investigation into whether he could plausibly do the wrong thing. And that, to me, sort of the story of like Mike Pence's sort of core moral cowardice is actually totally reflected in January 6th, which is, in a weird way, Mike Pence was too much of a coward on January 6th to do the wrong thing, which was the thing that he really wanted to do, and so he did the right thing. And like, that's a really hard place for American democracy to be sort of hinging on, is when you sort of have your vice president like calling up Dan Quayle and being like, are you entirely sure I can't overturn the election? Because I really would prefer to, because that would be easier for me. Yeah.
Can we take a page out of Silicon Valley and give everyone a bonus first?
Right, exactly. The old sort of Silicon Valley Bank challenge of let's declare bankruptcy the day after everyone gets their bonuses paid out. All right, last question. Anyone? Yes?
I have always been a firm believer that you can talk rational political discourse with your enemies, your opponents, but in the last few years, with social media being the way it is, I've come upon, just recently, 2 occasions when that just seemed impossible, because the other side has all the facts and they can look it up. One in particular, I was invited to a dinner in the town of Georgia, and there was an ultra-conservative there, and I was told not to talk politics. He apparently either wasn't told that, or he found a way to corner me so that he and I were alone. And he started immediately talking about climate change.
Yeah.
He says, this is a liberal conspiracy. I have all of the facts and figures to prove that it's a total hoax. And then 4 years ago, I went to Florida for a few weeks and stayed with a friend of mine who is also a very strong supporter of Donald Trump. And we were talking about how climate change is killing animals, in particular the polar bears, around the Hudson Bay. Mm-hmm. He pulled out his iPhone and looked up a website that shows that the real problem is not global warming, but the fact that there are more than twice as many polar bears roaming around the Hudson Bay as there were even 15 years ago.
Yeah.
The problem is there's no food for them and they're dying, searching for food. How do you talk with somebody like that?
Yeah, so it is a tremendous challenge, and it's one that I think sort of people are feeling at their local community level in a way that they didn't before. And this is the data of the Thanksgiving dinners, which is it's sort of becoming harder to have these conversations in the places and ways that we are used to having them. Sort of one of the reasons that like local politics generally stays in theory less polarized and more apolitical is like, Nancy down the street, Fred, at town meeting day, and you may disagree, but like you're gonna see each other 17 more times over the course of the next month, at the store, and like there's sort of only so much that you can scream at Fred before, it's gonna get really awkward. And America is sort of gotten happy with that awkwardness in a way that I think is really hard for us to begin to unwind. And I don't have, I don't have real concrete solutions about how we begin to unwind that. In part for everything that you are talking about, which is, the way that social media is changing this, the way that, the collapse of local media is changing this. Vermont, when we think about the Vermont news landscape, when my dad was the head of the AP bureau here, his office was 12 reporters. And today it is 1.5. And so if you think of, the AP as sort of the main backbone of most of the state's coverage, which it is not anymore, to be clear. I mean, that's gone to VT Digger and 7 Days and VPR. That's a lot of stories that are not getting written. That's a lot of, sort of local accountability journalism that isn't happening anymore. And one of the things, and this comes to the local politics question, one of the things we are living through right now that you can see reflected in the assignments of the FBI to its public corruption squads is local politics is getting more corrupt. And it's getting more corrupt nationally as a trend, because if you are the water board or the sewer board or the school board, there's a high likelihood no one is showing up to your meetings anymore. And that there's sort of used to be this sort of inherent check that there would be a reporter sitting in the sewer board meeting, double checking at the most basic level that the sewer commissioner was not hiring his nephew to build the sewer for 3x the cost of the other contractor. And now you can hand out those contracts without necessarily thinking that anyone is ever going to look at them. And that's a really challenging thing at the local level to, again, begin to unwind. So, all right, thank you all for coming today. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay for lunch today because I'm, as John mentioned, I'm actually on deadline for my next book, which I have to turn in on Monday. So I'm going to run home and keep writing. But it'll be out in November. It is a history of the US government's hunt for UFOs and NASA's search for extraterrestrial intelligence out in the galaxy. So maybe if there's not hope here, there is hope somewhere. Thank you all. The podcast. Yes, the podcast is called Long Shadow, Rise of the American Far Right, and it's the second season. The first season, which is available now, if you're interested, is based on my 9/11 work, and it's this, and it's the lingering questions of 9/11. And then Long Shadow premieres April 12th, and you can get it sort of wherever you get podcasts or listen to podcasts. So it's Long Shadow, Rise of the American Far Right. It's got a very cool eagle strangling a snake logo. So, all right. Thank you all.